like, why aren't we called the Henrican Church? You know, because Calvin started the Calvinist Church, and Luther started the Lutheran Church, and Henry VIII started the Anglican Church so that he could get a divorce, right?
Hi, I'm River.
I'm Abraham,
And this is the Theology Over Drinks podcast.
where we discuss theology over drinks.
So tonight we're discussing if Henry VIII created the Anglican Church.
And we'll be drinking Scapegrace vodka.
Cheers.
Cheers. That's really good.
That is good. That is really good.
Shout
Yeah.
out to Scapegrace.
Yeah. All right, so one of the most common arguments that we've heard against the Anglican Church is that it was supposedly created by King Henry VIII so that he could divorce his wife.
Yeah, and this is honestly what I believed when I first came to Anglicanism as well, as I think a lot of people do, because it's such a prominent idea that it's very easy to just take it at face value and not really look into the historical accuracy of it.
Yeah.
Which I think you'll find listening to these points that we'll talk about, it's just not accurate.
No. Now, one reason for that is it's not quite right to say, anyway, that in the 1500s this denomination called the Anglican Church or Anglicanism was created or invented. It was originally called the Church of England, and in England it's still called the Church of England, and the idea was simply to restore the Church of England to a primitive and pure form of Christianity without the corruptions of Roman Catholicism that were introduced in the Middle Ages. That was the idea.
Yeah, I mean, the Archbishop of Canterbury, when England was Roman Catholic, Thomas Cranmer, he was one of the main figures in establishing the distinctive points of what we would call Anglicanism today. And his line of succession, apostolic succession, goes all the way back to Augustine of Canterbury, which was hundreds of years earlier.
Yeah.
So this idea that Anglicanism was one of these other Protestant denominations that started in the 1500s, it's not true when you look at the historical facts of it.
Yeah, exactly. So it wasn't like a new group of people came along, created this denomination. We sort of see our origin of them. We actually trace our succession way back before the 1500s. Yeah. Okay. So why then do people say that Henry VIII created the Anglican Church?
Yeah, well, the issue is that Henry VIII wanted a divorce from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. The Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, and so the Archbishop of Canterbury decided to allow the divorce to happen and remarry Henry VIII to his mistress. And in response to this, the Pope excommunicated both of them. This led to a lot of issues because now the whole of England was no longer in communion with Rome.
Yeah, exactly. But the English people weren't exactly dismayed by this, and in fact things have been leading up to this for quite a while. The English people were starting to feel that the Pope was something of a foreign tyrant who was restricting English nationality, and the Reformation in Europe was starting to spread into England. The ideas were becoming very popular with the English people. So it was almost inevitable that something was eventually going to happen.
Yeah. So while it was for the first time that England split away from Rome, that happened for the first time under Henry VIII. It's not accurate to say that he started this denomination that we now call Anglicanism.
No, and one reason for that is he opposed all of the things that define what Anglicanism is. He opposed, for instance, having the liturgy in English. He actually killed many of the men whose ideas would later influence what the Anglican Church believes. And he released the 6 Articles and the King's Book, which, for instance, denied justification by faith, a key Anglican doctrine. It also said that clergy had to be celibate. It said that wine in the Eucharist should be denied to the laity, a key Roman Catholic idea at the time, and that only priests could drink the Eucharistic wine. Well, it's very important for Anglicans that we deny that. And it said that there were 7 sacraments, etc. All of the things that define Anglicanism he opposed. But it wasn't until Edward VI, that's Henry VIII's heir, until his reign, that some of the distinctive features of Anglicanism started to arise.
Yeah. And another important issue is that England became Roman Catholic again after all this happened.
Yeah, exactly.
When Queen Mary I started her reign,
Mhm.
she basically repealed all of the changes that were made.
Yeah,
Everything
exactly.
that happened that moved the English Church towards Protestantism under Edward VI, all of that was repealed under Mary I, and they were back in full communion with Rome.
Yeah, exactly. So even if you were to say that the Anglican Church was created by Henry VIII because it was under his reign that England was no longer in communion with Rome, well, right after Edward VI, Mary I ascends to the throne, is back in full communion, repeals all the changes.
Yeah.
So it's just the decisive moment where England broke communion with Rome wasn't even under Henry VIII at all.
No, exactly. It was actually under Elizabeth I.
Right.
Which was the final time where the Church of England split away from Rome.
Yeah.
And under her was when all of these distinctive points of Anglicanism, modern Anglicanism, started to emerge in the Elizabethan religious settlement from 1558.
That's right. Yeah.
That's where we get things like the Book of Common Prayer and the 39 Articles, which are two of the most important documents in Anglicanism.
Yes. Yeah.
And all of the things in these documents were opposed by Henry VIII, and they were officially instated in the church under Elizabeth I.
Exactly. And the most distinctive quality of Anglicanism is probably that it's a via media, or a middle road, between Catholicism and Protestantism. So under Henry VIII's reign, England was essentially Roman Catholic. The only difference was they weren't under a pope. Under Edward VI's reign, it was essentially Protestant. Now under Elizabeth I's reign, it goes into the middle. Some of the Protestant reforms are kept, and then most of the Catholic ideas are kept. It's just that the things that are taken away are what's considered to be a sort of medieval corruption of Roman Catholicism. So they're finding that nice middle ground. That specifically happened under Elizabeth I's reign. So
yeah. Basically, like one of the big issues was one of the big things that was kept was the idea of the real presence in the Eucharist.
Yes.
For instance.
Yeah.
That was kept in Anglicanism, but the Roman Catholic idea of transubstantiation was denied.
That's right. Yeah. And liturgy, a very Catholic style of worship, that was retained, but it was no longer in Latin. It was now in English.
Yeah. And clergy could marry.
Yeah.
But the Catholic orders of bishops and priests and deacons were kept.
Yeah, yeah. Apostolic succession as well, that continued, but the Pope was no longer seen as the head bishop or the head of the church. The monarch was now seen as the head.
Yeah, and only baptism and the Eucharist were considered sacraments.
Yeah.
The other five Roman Catholic sacraments were continued, but they weren't referred to as sacraments. They weren't considered to be salvific.
Yeah, that's a classic example of the via media between Catholicism and Protestantism. So all that happened under the reign of Elizabeth I.
Yeah, and this is an important distinction to make, because if it was Henry VIII that started this church that we now call the Anglican Church, then it can be said that it's just a product of a tyrant's, desire for power and personal gain, right?
Yeah, totally.
But because we now see it for what it was historically, we can see that it's really a response to legitimate theological principles.
Definitely, yeah.
Those being that the Roman Catholic Church was an error. There were a lot of things that were just, wrong that the Roman Catholic Church was doing at the time. But the other issue is that the Protestants, the Reformers, went too extremely against those things.
Definitely, yeah.
And so they lost a lot of the important fundamentals of Catholicism and Christianity.
Yeah.
So basically, under Elizabeth I, the Anglican Church retained the core values of Catholicism and corrected some of the issues, and then also denied the extremities of the Protestant reformers, but kept in moderation the things that they addressed.
That's right. So it was founded on theological principles, not for personal gain, and that's a very good ground to make those changes.
Yeah.
And the fact is that a lot of those Roman Catholic corruptions that were taken away were unjust.
Yeah.
So for the English people, their liturgy wasn't even in a language they could speak. The Eucharist happened only a few times a year, and the wine was withheld to the laity. They couldn't read the Bible, and plenty of other things to mention. Something needed to change.
Yeah.
And under Elizabeth's reign, those changes were made under really good motivations.
Yeah. So the issue then becomes, can a monarch, a secular monarch, really be trusted or allowed to make changes in the church at all?
Yes.
That this is probably the next most common complaint.
Exactly. That a king or a queen came along, split from Rome, which they don't have the authority to do, and made changes they don't have the authority to make. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, it's not a very good complaint, because if anyone looks to the early church as sort of a golden standard of Christianity, it's a bit of a contradiction, because in the early church, emperors essentially ran the church. All 7 of the ecumenical councils that Catholics and the Orthodox and Anglicans see as being really important moments in Christianity, they were all presided over by emperors.
Yeah.
They were all convened by emperors. And emperors in the early church, they could appoint their own bishops. And then one of the most beloved emperors of the early church, Justinian I, in the 6th century, he claimed the right to make even the most minute changes to Christian doctrine and practice.
Yeah.
And no one complains about that.
Exactly. And I mean, the Council of Nicaea, which is one of the most accepted councils by pretty much every Christian denomination.
Yeah, the most important council.
Yeah. That was presided over by Emperor Constantine.
Yeah.
And he was the one who officially declared that Donatism was a heresy.
Exactly. And this was someone who wasn't even born a Christian. He was a convert.
Yeah.
And he makes these huge decisions that Donatism was a heresy. Yeah.
So if you're going to say that the early church is this important thing that we need to look back to be accurate on what Christianity is, then you can't say that monarchs have no place in it.
Exactly. Yeah. And now, as for Elizabeth I, she didn't actually personally come up with any doctrine or practice. She instead presided over archbishops of Canterbury who made those changes themselves, such as Thomas Cranmer and Matthew Parker.
Yeah. So, essentially, the answer to the question, did Henry VIII found the Anglican Church, is
no.
No.
Yeah. And although the Anglican Church was never, so to speak, created in the 1500s, as we said at the beginning, it was a restoration of pure Christianity, we can say that it was under the reign of Elizabeth I that the distinctive reforms to the Church of England were made that define what Anglicanism is to this day.
Yes. And, well, on that note,
God save the Queen.